This is the fifth video made for IEB students in grade 12. In this lesson, we'll look at the second scene of Act 2 of The Tempest. Act 2 consists of just two scenes in which the conflict is established. In the second scene of this act, we focus on Caliban and the conflict that he experiences with all of these visitors to the island. Visitors, maybe I should call them intruders. All of the obstacles are made clear to the audience. Alonso must surely still be in danger, as Antonio and Sebastian have indicated their intent to kill him. Ferdinand and Miranda have to negotiate their way around Prospero. And Prospero has to figure out a way to avenge the original crime committed against him and his daughter Miranda by his brother. And of course, Caliban is in a state of permanent conflict with Prospero and those who have landed on his island. And let's not forget Ariel's conflict with Prospero. Both he and Caliban are unwilling, unenthusiastic servants. And when we think about this, it would appear that Prospero is at the center of most of these conflicts. In this scene, other members of the shipwreck, Trinculo and Stefano, meet Caliban and compare him to the freak shows that they have seen in England. They drink together and Caliban begs to worship Stefano. They end up mocking Caliban as a ridiculous monster. This is an extension of the theme of men and monsters, as we listen to conversations about the nature of Caliban. The quick summary of the scene is this. Caliban has been doing jobs for Prospero. He hates Prospero for forcing him into being a slave. Prospero has cast a curse upon Caliban. That means whenever Caliban complains about being Prospero's slave, he has feelings of pinching all over his body. Caliban complains, feels the pinching, and lies down on the ground and covers himself with a cloak because another storm is coming. Trinculo, the jester, the clown, also hears the thunder and looks for some cover from the storm. He sees Caliban on the ground covered in his cloak and is curious about him. He thinks he can make friends with Caliban so that he can put him in the circus when he returns home to Naples. He joins Caliban underneath the cloak to shelter from the rain. Stefano arrives, singing and drinking. And because he's drunk, he thinks the four legs underneath the cloak is a four-legged monster. He drinks some more. Caliban is scared of Trinculo. He thinks he's a spirit of Prospero's trying to torment him. And they are revealed from underneath the cloak and get drunk together. In the previous scene, Act 2, Scene 1, the humor was created by a fairly sophisticated use of linguistic gymnastics. There were loads of clever puns and nudge, nudge, wink, wink types of witty wordplay. In this second scene of the act, the humor becomes more crude, more obvious. It's that knockabout, unsophisticated humor that gets cheap laughs from the audience. It's more visual than verbal. Caliban enters carrying wood and grumbling about his master Prospero. From his description here, it appears that Prospero uses his magic, his spirits, to torment Caliban by pinching him whenever he feels that Caliban needs reining in or reminding of who is apparently in charge on the island. Take note of Caliban's opening speech in this scene. You'll note that he speaks in verse. Compare this to the way that Stefano and Trinculo speak when they engage with Caliban. Caliban spots the court jester Trinculo and assumes that he is one of Prospero's spirits sent to torment him, so he hides in the bushes and watches as Trinculo stumbles around. In Shakespeare's plays, there's a rich tradition of the wise court jester, the fool, who acts as a chorus-like figure, imparting pearls of wisdom under the guise of his cultivated foolishness. The language of these fools is often cryptically comic, and they get away with incisive and philosophical commentary as they observe the characters around them. Trinculo is not one of these wise courtly jesters. He's an idiot, a dolt. So yes, he provides comic relief, but without the wisdom of the traditional Shakespearean fools. Stefano is the drunken butler, so don't expect any wisdom from him either. And listen to the way that these two speak, and contrast it with Caliban's speech. While Caliban speaks in verse, these two clowns, literally and figuratively, speak in prose. This is a deliberate ploy by Shakespeare to make us think about Caliban's position. He sounds superior to these two twits. Their prose proves to us just how dense, how insignificant they are, despite their coming from the so-called civilized world, with Caliban, the supposed savage, on the island. Trinculo describes Caliban as a monster. He thinks at first that he's some sort of fish with a fishy smell, but comes to the conclusion that Caliban must be an islander, not a fish, because his fins are like arms and he's legged like a man. How do you picture him? As a man or as a monster? In your thinking about colonization and the attitude of the colonizers to anything that they discovered in the New Worlds that appeared different or odd to them, you should consider the diction, the imagery in Trinculo's speech as he looks at Caliban. In this quote, he refers to the so-called freak shows that were popular in England, where artifacts and goods from the new lands were put on display for the English to gawp at. And horrifically, it wasn't just artifacts on display, but people too. When Trinculo refers to the board here, he means the advertising boards that were used to entice Londoners into these exhibitions to gaze in wonder at things and people that were foreign to them. You might have seen something like this: a woman with a skin condition, or a bearded lady, or a Burmese woman wearing traditional necklaces, or conjoined twins. I'm sure that you're aware of the display of an African woman in Europe by the name of Sarah or Sarkia Bartman. The posters advertised her as the Hottentot Venus. She was stared at, poked, prodded and measured in numerous cities, with no thought given to her dignity as a woman, as a human being. And when she died, her remains were preserved and put on display in a museum in Paris. And it was only in 2002 that her remains were returned for a respectful burial in South Africa. Trinculo's observations about Caliban's differences are echoed centuries later in the Sarah Bartman travesty. You'd have thought that by now we'd have learned to celebrate our differences. Clearly not. This is the beauty of Shakespeare. Themes that we recognize and can discuss with our own cultural references. more than 4 centuries later. For all the underlying seriousness of the discussion concerning Caliban's appearance, this scene does provide some comic relief. Trinculo and Caliban both take cover together under a piece of material, the gabardine. The drunk Stefano staggers onto the stage, and there follows an amusing interlude where he is confused by the sight of what appears to be a 4-legged, 2-headed creature in front of him. The humor is visual and not particularly witty or clever. The way that Stefano uses alcohol to influence Caliban is noteworthy. Here in South Africa, farm labourers were often paid with wine, the so-called dop system. It's a means of enslaving people, a means of keeping them subjugated. Of course, you should see the irony that Stefano himself is enslaved to this alcohol, this dop. For all of his judgment over Caliban, Stefano is no paragon of virtue. He is not superior to Caliban at all. This makes Caliban's worship of Stefano tragically foolish. The audience can clearly see that if Caliban swaps allegiance from Prospero to Stefano, he will gain nothing. Caliban believes that Stefano holds the keys to his freedom. It's a naive belief. Caliban would just be swapping one master for another. Shakespeare's portrayal of Caliban is that of a rich and complex character. He cannot be dismissed as a brutal and treacherous savage, and he's not just a slave to a master. He is neither noble savage nor diabolical monster. You should continue adding to your notes on the various themes in the play. Caliban's search for freedom and identity have come to the fore in this scene. Your character notes on him should be taking shape as well. The conversation between Caliban and Stefano centers in part around the issue of authority and power. You should consider Caliban's willingness to switch allegiance from Prospero to Stefano. Is it possibly a case of out of the frying pan and into the fire? As with so many characters and items on the island, it's difficult to see what's real and what's not. In this scene, Stefano's confusion when he sees Trinculo and Caliban under the gabardine is an amusing visual reminder of this theme. People are often not what they appear to be. Much of the scene has to do with the notion of brave new worlds, which have been colonized by travelers who look upon native inhabitants with a mixture of disdain and curiosity, while ensuring that the native inhabitants are forced into a position of inferiority to the colonizers. The motifs and symbols in this scene are fairly obvious. At the beginning of this scene, Caliban is carrying piles of wood for his master Prospero. It's a reminder of his position as a slave. Later, when Prospero bewitches Ferdinand, he also makes him carry wood. This image says a lot more about Prospero than it does about Caliban and Ferdinand. Don't forget about the spirits as a motif. Ariel is the one we get to know as a character, but there are others whose job it is to torment everyone that crosses Prospero. These are not the charming, innocuous creatures of fairy tale tradition. These have a mischievous, even malevolent side to them. It's not that easy to classify them as good or evil. And then we have spirits of a different kind, alcohol. Yes, it adds to the comic relief of this scene, but there's an implied criticism as well. Alcohol used as a method of subjugating others. As always, there are a lot of quotes that are important. I've highlighted 3 for you to think about. When Trinculo sees Caliban, he refers to the oddity of this creature and ponders the possibility of this strange beast making a man. In other words, Trinculo wonders whether he could make his fortune with Caliban. Trinculo says that misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows. He means that interesting or miserable times can bring people together who would not normally have anything to do with one another. Caliban's blind allegiance to Stefano is ill-considered. You should think about why Caliban is so willing to replace one master with another. Surely freedom from all masters would be his goal. Your final assessment will be a literary essay. You should start thinking about the types of questions that could be asked on this play. Here's an example of an essay that would refer only to Act 2, Scene 2. Write an essay in which you analyze the different forms of humor in Act 2, Scene 2. You will need to give examples of both slapstick or physical comedy and verbal jokes. Identify one aspect of this scene that would have been funny to Shakespeare's audiences, but is less likely to make us laugh today. Now, it's unlikely that an exam essay question would be so narrowly focused, but it would be good practice for you to write this one in preparation for the end-of-year finals. You could also be asked to focus on some of the more minor characters. Act 2, Scene 2 is a good place to start with this topic. Stefano and Trinculo are lightweight characters and have no place in a play such as The Tempest. To what extent do you agree or disagree with this statement? To improve your literary essay writing skills, you need to practice, practice, and practice. That's it. Act 2 is done. The next video lesson will introduce the rising action that leads to the climax of Act 3. Do share these video lessons with your friends and colleagues in other schools, and share your own materials too.